Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Tuesday, April 22nd, 2025. All right, so I hope everybody had a good weekend. Happy Easter to everyone who celebrates. I had a nice long weekend with my family. Lots of stuff went down over the weekend. We're going to get into some of that. But the first story at the top of antiwar.com today, Mike Huckabee backs Israel's total blockade on Gaza. So Mike Huckabee, the U.S.'s ambassador to Israel, the new U.S. ambassador to Israel, responded to the World Health Organization asking him to pressure Israel to allow humanitarian aid into Gaza by shifting the blame to Hamas, backing Israel's collective punishment of the civilian population of Gaza. And this is not a surprise coming from Mike Huckabee, but this is what he said in a video statement released on X, quote, "What I would like to suggest is that we work together on putting the pressure where it really belongs, on Hamas," end quote. Again, this is a response to him being asked to put pressure on Israel to allow humanitarian aid into Gaza. And the reason why he's asked to do that is because Israel, the Israeli military, is the one preventing anything from entering Gaza, imposing this complete blockade on Gaza. And he's saying, we got to really put the pressure on Hamas. So just completely backing this clear war crime of depriving the civilian population of food, fuel, humanitarian aid, of all kinds of goods. So Huckabee called for Hamas to sign an agreement so humanitarian aid could go to the people of Gaza. He said that when that happens and the Israeli hostages are released, then we hope that humanitarian aid will flow and flow freely, knowing that it will be done without Hamas. So, he's saying Hamas has got to sign some sort of agreement to let aid in. The thing is that they did sign an agreement back in January, this ceasefire deal that allowed part of the deal was making sure Israel allowed aid into Gaza. Israel completely violated that deal in multiple ways, including on March 2nd when they imposed this total blockade on Gaza. Hamas has also been offering to release all Israeli hostages in exchange for a permanent ceasefire, an Israeli withdrawal, and end to the blockade. And of course, Israel does not want to do that. And Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz said last week that no humanitarian aid would be entering Gaza and called the blockade on aid one of Israel's central pressure tools against Hamas. So essentially saying that they're using this collective punishment as leverage over Hamas. But again, it's punishing the entire population of Gaza, which about half of the whole population is children. And Huckabee, as I said, this is not a surprise coming from him. He is one of these Christian Zionists who believes that God gave the modern state of Israel, that God gave, historic Palestine, gave this land to the modern state of Israel. This is his attitude going in. So, of course, he's the U.S. ambassador to Israel. That's his official position. But he's essentially just acting as another official, another representative for the state of Israel. You see the way he's responding here. And I put in some of his greatest hits here when it comes to the things that he said about Israel, about settlements, saying that he doesn't believe there's an occupation of the West Bank. He doesn't believe that there's a such thing as a Palestinian, saying they're just Arabs that should go to other Arab land. Of course, he says there's no settlements in Gaza. In the West Bank, he calls them communities. Again, all sorts of other stuff he said like that. So again, no surprise that he's doing this, but it's just really shameful to see the U.S. Government openly back this policy of starvation, collective punishment of the civilians of Gaza. All right, so the next one here, Pope Francis called for peace in Gaza in his last address. So the big news on Monday, the big global news was the death of Pope Francis at 88 years old. And I thought it would be important to highlight his calls for peace in Palestine, peace in Gaza, what his position has been on this issue for a long time. And So the Vatican announced on Monday that Pope Francis had died in the morning, a day after appearing publicly for Easter and delivering an address where he called for peace in Gaza and in other conflict zones. Pope Francis had been outspoken in his calls for a ceasefire in Gaza and his criticism of Israel's killing of civilians in Gaza. He also kept in close contact with the Holy Family Church, the only Catholic church in Gaza, by holding nightly phone calls with its priests and parishioners. You see this photo here. This is from Mass at the Holy Family Catholic Church in Gaza City, Mass for Pope Francis. So this was from his address. So he came out on Easter as a surprise because his health was really bad. It was nice to see him come out and bless the people there. And then one of his aides, an archbishop, actually read his address because of his poor health situation. And as I understand it, even through his poor health, he called the church in Gaza every night. The last time he called them was on Saturday night, and he died, early Monday morning. So this is from his address. He said, quote, "I think of the people of Gaza and its Christian community in particular, where the terrible conflict continues to cause death and destruction and to create a dramatic and deplorable humanitarian situation. I appeal to the warring parties, call a ceasefire, release the hostages, and come to the aid of a starving people that aspires to a future of peace," end quote. Palestinian Christians in Gaza told Reuters that they were heartbroken at the loss of Pope Francis. George Antone, the head of the emergency committee at the Holy Family Church, said, quote, "We lost a saint who taught us every day how to be brave, how to keep patient and stay strong. We lost a man who fought every day in every direction to protect this small herd of his," end quote. So Cardinal Pier Battista Pizzaballa, he's the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem, he said in a condolence message that Gaza was a symbol of Francis's pontificate. He said, quote, "He was always close to the poor and against war. War is a defeat." He repeated this continuously, end quote. So Pizzaballa has visited Gaza twice since October 7th, 2023, and he's actually in the running to be the next pope, according to all the news reports. And then I linked to this website here. It's the College of Cardinals, and it outlines kind of the positions of the cardinals, the front runners, to be the next pope. And Pizzaballa is in the running, as far as I understand it. And it just happened, he just turned 60 years old. So he's actually kind of young for the position. I think that's one thing working against them. They like to appoint someone who's old, who's not going to be pope for like decades and decades. But he, I thought it was really powerful, the fact that he visited Gaza, and he actually went twice. The photos of a Catholic cardinal with his giant crucifix walking around the rubble. I put in some things here. I've talked about this stuff quite a bit, but just speaking of Pizzaballa and Pope Francis's, their response to what's been happening in Gaza. Back in December 2023, Israeli snipers killed 2 Christian women at the Holy Family Church, and Pope Francis denounced that as terrorism. Pizzaballa called it murder. And over the past 18 months, again, Francis has called for a ceasefire. He's called an investigation to whether Israel's committing genocide. He's said the bombing of civilians in Gaza is unacceptable. And even in the face, he received a lot of backlash at one point from Israeli officials and just kept doubling down. And I know, I've seen people say he could have done more. Of course, I guess he could have tried to do more, but I really think that the purpose of the Vatican is to kind of be neutral and call for diplomacy. I mean, when you're facing an evil like what's happening in Gaza, that's different. But I still think what he has done is pretty powerful, and Palestinian Christians are very happy with him, just because you consider what other Christian leaders in the West have been putting themselves out there like that for him. So Munther Isaac, who's an evangelical Lutheran pastor in Bethlehem, he said in a post on X that Francis was a dear friend of Palestinians and Palestinian Christians. He said, quote, "Pope Francis was beloved in Palestine. He conveyed true compassion to Palestinians, most notably to those in Gaza during this genocide," end quote. So I forgot about this, but just going over all this stuff reminded me. Back in 2014, Francis, is 1 year into his pontificate, he prayed at the West Bank barrier wall, the apartheid wall in the West Bank. And, there's photos of him standing there with like graffiti that says Free Palestine, and he's praying at the wall. So Isaac said of this, quote, "When Pope Francis stopped, touched the wall, and said a prayer, it was truly a monumental moment that made waves in world news. Pope Francis couldn't help but notice the ugliness of this concrete structure at the heart of Bethlehem," end quote. So another thing about Francis, he also consistently called for peace in Ukraine through negotiations, and he got a hard time for this. He pointed to the root causes of the conflict, like NATO expansion. And so he said this in the Easter address, quote, "May the risen Christ grant Ukraine, devastated by war, his Easter gift of peace and encourage all parties involved to pursue efforts aimed at achieving a just and lasting peace," end quote. Francis also called for a settlement between Armenia and Azerbaijan and for an end to the conflict in Yemen. Those are the specific things that he addressed in this speech. But, looking at what he's been saying for the past few years, he's always calling for peace all around the world, in Sudan, Myanmar, and all these places. And of course, he's gotten the most heat for calling for peace in Gaza. So rest in peace, Pope Francis. He was. It's interesting to see a lot of the reaction to his death. Of course, there's a lot of people saying a lot of nasty things and everything. He was kind of divisive among Catholics. For other reasons, not related to this stuff, but I thought for our purposes at antiwar.com, we should highlight how he was very good on the issue of war. And that follows the teachings of the Catholic Church. All right, so the next one here, Smotrich says Gaza must be eliminated and hostages are not a priority. So Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich said Monday that freeing Israeli captives in Gaza was not the most important goal, and called for Israel to eliminate what he called the Gaza problem. So Smotrich, the leader of the far-right religious Zionist party, suggested Israel had the opportunity to eliminate Gaza now that President Biden was out of office and Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant had been fired and members of opposition parties were out of the Israeli government. He said in a radio interview, quote, "We need to eliminate the Gaza problem. We have a tremendous opportunity and the excuses are gone. There's no Biden, no Gallant, no Gantz or Eisenkot. We must storm Gaza and end the problem and prove to the whole world and the people of Israel that there is a military solution to terror," end quote. Smotrich also criticized former IDF Chief of Staff Herzi Halevi for letting some humanitarian aid into Gaza. That was obviously before the March 2nd blockade. I forgot exactly when Halevi stepped down. It wasn't that long ago, a few months ago. I think maybe in January. So Smotrich recently said that not even a grain of wheat will enter Gaza. So Smotrich's comments on Monday angered family members of Israeli hostages in Gaza, and the Hostages and Missing Families Forum said, quote, "The families have only one word this morning, shame. At least the minister is revealing the harsh truth to the public. This government has consciously decided to abandon the hostages," end quote. And Hamas has repeatedly offered to free all remaining Israeli hostages in exchange for permanent truce, as I mentioned in the last story. And that's kind of the response from kind of, the opposition in Israel is, this is clearly, it's very obvious from what the Israeli government has done that freeing the Israelis in Gaza is not the priority. If it was, they would have implemented the full ceasefire deal. They want to destroy Gaza. Ethnic cleansing is the ultimate goal of the Netanyahu government. All right, so the next one here, Israeli strikes kill 37 in Gaza over 24 hours. So Gaza's health ministry said Monday that Israeli attacks killed 37 Palestinians over the previous 24-hour period as relentless Israeli strikes continued to pound targets across the Strip, and another 2 bodies were recovered from the rubble. The health ministry said that 62 Palestinians were also wounded during that time, and the ministry's numbers only account for dead and wounded Palestinians brought to hospitals. Lots of attacks on tent camps. You see this photo here of them putting out a fire at a tent camp that was bombed. According to the Palestinian news agency Wafa, at least 4 civilians were killed by Israeli strikes on tents in Gaza City, and 5 were killed by an Israeli strike on a house in the southern city of Khan Yunis. In Rafah, 2 children were killed by an Israeli drone strike. And since Israel resumed its genocidal war in Gaza on March 18th, at least 1,864 Palestinians have been killed. So nearly 1,900 in just over a month. All right, so the next one here, Israel's deploying unmanned bulldozers in Gaza. So this This article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. So the Israeli military has increasingly opted to deploy an unmanned version of Caterpillar's D9 bulldozers to a number of battlefields. The remotely operated systems allow the IDF to flatten areas without risking additional troops. So these are remote-controlled bulldozers, self-driving bulldozers. I guess they're not self-driving if they're remote control, but they are, they don't need a human in them to operate. According to the Times of Israel, Tel Aviv has deployed the unmanned D9 or robo-dozer to Gaza and Lebanon since October 7, 2023. Israeli officials say the IDF is ramping up its use of the system. One source told AFP that Israel has used robotic tools for over a decade, but in very small numbers. Now it is being used in large-scale warfare. The robo-dozer was developed by Israel Aerospace Industries, which claims the platform is the ultimate combat bulldozer. The website explains that the robo-dozer's integration into military engineering units significantly boosts their capability to rapidly alter landscapes to favor defensive or offensive operations. So Israel, the IDF, really makes use of the bulldozer as a military weapon because they're always demolishing buildings and leveling places. And that's because it's clear that Israel's goal is expansion in a lot of these places, not just in Gaza, but obviously, and not just in Gaza and the West Bank, but also we're seeing it in southern Syria now and southern Lebanon. So that's why you always see the bulldozers are deployed. I mean, they go into, especially the refugee camps in the West Bank right now, that they just went in and just completely destroyed the place. All right, so the next one here, Israel is trying to undermine talks with the U.S., the U.S.-Iran talks. So Iran's foreign ministry said on Monday that Israel was seeking to undermine Tehran's nuclear talks with Washington, comments that came after a report said Israel was considering a limited attack on Iran. So Iranian foreign ministry spokesman Esmail Baghaei, he said that a coalition is forming to undermine and disrupt the diplomatic process and that the Zionist regime is at the center of this effort. He added that hawks in the U.S. are also involved in the effort to sabotage the diplomacy. He said, quote, alongside it are a series of warmongering currents in the United States and figures from different factions, end quote. So as I covered last week, the New York Times has reported that President Trump decided not to back an Israeli plan to attack Iran, which would have involved significant U.S. support in favor of pursuing diplomacy. On Friday, a report from Reuters said that Israel was still considering some sort of limited attack on Iran, even though it didn't have the support of the Trump administration. The report said that Israeli officials hadn't made a decision and that it was unclear if they would go through with the attack. So Trump has repeatedly threatened to bomb Iran. If a deal is not reached, they're essentially negotiating under the threat of military action. Israel has a history of trying to sabotage negotiations between the U.S. and Iran. The one I always go back to is in April 2021 when President Biden, the Biden administration, started negotiations with Iran. Israel planted an explosive and blew up an explosive in an Iranian nuclear facility. So, all these threats, and I always have to mention these stories that the U.S. intelligence threat assessment recently said that there's no evidence Iran is making a nuclear weapon or that the Ayatollah has decided to reverse his ban on the development of weapons of mass destruction. So one thing that happened over the weekend that Kyle Anzalone covered for us, he did a lot of writing for me on Sunday, was the U.S. and Iran held talks, and it seems like they're going well. So they had another round of talks on Saturday, indirect as far as I understand it. Steve Witkoff on one side, Iran's foreign minister on the other, and they agreed to meet again next Saturday. But in between that, on Wednesday, they're holding meetings at the expert level, as they call it, to discuss technical details of a potential deal. So that seems like there is some progress being made. All right, the next one here. Trump's NSC director for Israel and Iran worked for the Israeli Ministry of Defense. This article is from Drop Site News. So the American official overseeing White House policy toward both Israel and Iran inside the National Security Council formerly worked for the Israeli Ministry of Defense, Drop Site News has learned. Merev Saren's appointment as director for Israel and Iran at the NSC has not been previously reported, but her work with Israel's Ministry of Defense is well known among GOP circles. Saren's appointment gives Israel an unusual advantage in internal policy discussions, just as the Israeli government has launched a new campaign to pressure the American government to start a war with Iran rather than continue with negotiations toward a nuclear deal. NSC spokesman Brian Hughes confirmed that Saren is now an official at the NSC and defended her as a patriotic American. Saren includes her time with Israel's Ministry of Defense in her bio at the pro-Israel think tank Foundation for Defense of Democracies. The Israeli campaign has forced the issue into the top echelons of the government. At a high-level meeting, they go over what's going on with the potential Israeli attack on Iran and the discussions within the Trump administration. So it is something here. While this woman worked for the Israeli military, worked for the defense ministry, she participated in negotiations in the West Bank between Israel's coordinator for government activities in the territories and the Palestinian Authority, and that's the coordinator for government activities in the territories is the Israeli agency now refusing the entry of humanitarian aid into Gaza. So then she's on the National Security Council now. It's like, you think of any other foreign government that people could work for and still get high-level appointments within the U.S. government. All right, so the next one here, IDF chief tours Israeli-occupied Syria. So this one is from Jason Ditz. So the IDF chief of staff, Aimel Zamir, toured the Israeli-occupied area of southwest Syria on Sunday, speaking with commanders and approving new orders to continue the military operations against the area into the future, suggesting a long-term stay is the plan. Israel invaded Syria in December following the HTS takeover, and the IDF initially began seizing the demilitarized zone between the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights and the rest of Syria, but they've pushed further into the Quneitra and Dara governance since then. Zamir presented Israel having invaded Syria because it fell apart, ignoring that Israel and several other nations backed the Islamist rebellion for years to oust Assad, which ultimately led to HTS to seize control in 2024. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu even claimed credit for the regime change while invading at the same time. Zamir is now presenting military control over this part of Syria as vital and the best possible way for Israel to defend itself. So, more signs that this is a indefinite occupation of southern Syria here. All right, so the next one, U.S. airstrikes pound Yemen, killing 12 in the capital. So this article is from Will Porter. He wrote this up for us on Sunday while I was taking my day off for Easter. And this is another horrific Israeli, U.S. attack on Yemen. I get the U.S. and Israel mixed up quite a bit these days. So the U.S. military launched a series of airstrikes across Yemen on Sunday, killing at least 12 people in the capital city and targeting sites in 4 other provinces, according to local media reports. The operations came on the heels of another round of strikes that left several dead just one day prior. American warplanes attacked a number of areas around Sana'a on Sunday, including a sanitation facility and a marketplace, according to Al Masirah TV. There was also strikes on the coast of Hodeidah, as well as in Marib, Sada, and the Mawit governance. The Yemeni Health Ministry said at least 12 civilians were killed and 30 others were injured in the capital, but added that the number could still rise as emergency workers continue to dig victims out of the rubble. So as far as I understand it, the majority of these civilian casualties were in the market. It was a busy market that was bombed, and the U.S. is not releasing any information. They have we don't even have a U.S. side of the story because they're not telling us anything about their bombing campaign in Yemen, and nobody in the U.S. media is asking. The people who have access are not asking the questions about these airstrikes. And actually, the one thing that the U.S. military did claim was when they bombed the fuel port last week and slaughtered 80 civilians, workers and paramedics who arrived to the scene. So Will mentions that as well in this story, but footage that was alleged to show the marketplace attack and its aftermath has circulated online, with an incoming projectile seen seconds before it detonates near the ground. Another brief clip showed first responders and panicked bystanders after the strike on the Farwa market. And a day earlier, so this was on Sunday, on Saturday, they killed at least 2 people. U.S. airstrikes killed 2 people in the same, around the capital as well. And the Houthis, actually, since the last time I spoke with you, the Houthis shot down 2 more U.S. MQ-9 Reaper drones. So they're not stopping. They just keep firing missiles at Israel, shooting down drones, and claiming attacks on U.S. warships in the region. All right, so the next one here, Russia welcomes U.S. statements on NATO. So the Kremlin said on Monday that Moscow welcomed statements from U.S. officials that ruled out Ukrainian entry into NATO. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said, quote, "We have heard statements made at various levels in Washington that Ukraine's NATO membership is ruled out. That this is something that brings us satisfaction and aligns with our stance," end quote. So several high-level Trump administration officials, including President Trump himself, have said that any peace deal must include, would not include Ukrainian membership in NATO. Russia sought a guarantee from the U.S. that Ukraine would not join NATO before it launched the invasion in February 2022, but the Biden administration refused to really engage on that issue. And then during the short-lived peace talks in March and April of 2022 that were discouraged by the U.S., Russia's main demand was neutrality, Ukrainian neutrality. And that's according to the Ukrainian official who led the peace talks, the Ukrainian delegation in the peace talks. Secretary of State Marco Rubio on Friday, this is another thing that Kyle covered over the weekend. He said that the U.S. would decide in the coming days if a peace deal was possible in Ukraine. He said, quote, "We're not going to continue this endeavor for weeks and months on end, so we need to determine very quickly now, and I'm talking about a matter of days, whether or not this is doable in the next few weeks," end quote. So that's not good hearing from Marco Rubio, because Rubio, I am assuming what he's thinking is if the peace talks fail, well, we're just going to keep arming Ukraine, continue this proxy war indefinitely. But then you have Trump, who makes it kind of sound like the U.S. would just not be involved in the war anymore, which would ultimately make Ukraine, agree to Russia's terms for a peace deal. So this is what Trump said. This was, again, also on Friday. He said, quote, "Now, if for some reason one of the two parties makes it very difficult, we're just going to say, you're foolish, you're fools, you're horrible people, and we're just going to take a pass. But hopefully we won't have to do that," end quote. So in the meantime, the fighting in Ukraine continues. Putin declared an Easter ceasefire for 30 hours. Both sides accused the other of violations. And then on Monday, Russia announced that it was, launching attacks again. And it looks like it really hit Ukraine hard on Monday. So the war continues, and the outcome of these peace talks is just not clear right now. All right, so the last story here. China and the Philippines have a naval encounter ahead of U.S. drills. So this article is from the South China Morning Post, and it is from a part of the world that I really need to be paying more attention to. So the Chinese Navy said that it expelled a Philippine warship that illegally intruded into the waters of a disputed shoal in the South China Sea on Sunday, hours before the start of Washington and Manila's annual military drills. The People's Liberation Army Southern Theater Command said on Sunday that night that the BRP Apolinario Mabini, a Philippine Navy patrol vessel, was challenged near the Scarborough Shoal, which is claimed by Beijing and Manila. So these encounters happen. This is the part of the South China Sea where tensions are really high. There's all these disputed shoals that the Philippines and China both claim, and their navies and coast guards have these encounters there. Sometimes there's collisions, and the U.S. always says, in response to this, reminds China that the U.S.-Philippine Mutual Defense Treaty covers attacks on Philippine ships in the South China Sea, so essentially giving them a war guarantee if this maritime dispute turns hot, if they start shooting at each other. The U.S. is saying that they'll intervene directly. So it's a very dangerous part of the world, and this happens before the U.S. and the Philippines. They just started their annual, the Balakatan exercises. The U.S. deployed a new missile system for that. So tensions are very high between the U.S. and China over the Philippines and over the South China Sea. All right, so that is it for the news for today. Actually, I want to just mention a few things from yesterday's page. Some of it I kind of, it's similar to what I covered, but the one thing really I want to talk about these Pentagon firings. So we ran one story here that 3 DoD officials do not know why they were fired. Kelly Vlahos wrote this up at Responsible Statecraft. And these 3 officials are Dan Caldwell, Darren Selnick, and Colin Carroll. And so Dan Caldwell is the one who I'm familiar with. You know, he worked for Defense Priorities. He's against war with Iran and everything. He's what you call a restrainer in DC circles. And he's been fired, and the allegation is that he was involved in some leaks. And he says it's not true. He says he was not even investigated for it. He just did an interview with Tucker Carlson that came out today. I didn't have time to watch the whole thing, but I watched some bits and pieces of it. And yeah, he's saying, you know, there's no evidence that he was involved in these leaks. He said that he was not, you know, they didn't take his phone to investigate. They just fired him. So the suspicion is that these guys that are against war with Iran are being pushed out. And then people are going after Hegseth again because we ran a story on this. Apparently, he was texting people in a Signal chat, in a second Signal chat, that his wife was in about plans to attack Yemen. So people are calling for him to be fired. And, you know, the narrative I'm seeing is that the neocons are trying to take out Hegseth because he was against war with Iran, you know, based on that New York Times report. But I'm not convinced of that because that report said even Mike Waltz, you know, didn't want to back that particular attack. I mean, look at the way Hegseth handled Yemen, completely on board with the strikes, you know, convincing J.D. Vance to go along with it, celebrating it when, you know, bombing these residential buildings. So, you know, the fact that he was skeptical of backing an attack that Mike Waltz was also skeptical of. But what is happening is it does look like the people who are actually good, you know, better, like Dan Caldwell, who don't want war with Iran, are the ones who are getting pushed out. And there's a lot of calls for Hegseth to be fired. Trump's backing him for now, so we'll see how this all this plays out. Honestly, I really have no idea what is happening here. It's kind of confusing and it's tough to figure out, but I think it probably is in some way related to this push for war with Iran. So that's it for the news. Please go check out our viewpoints. We have one from Dan Steinbach, U.S. trade wars and military globalization spark complex alignments. One from Eldar Mamdov, Pope Francis's legacy of interfaith diplomacy. One from Edward Lazansky, toward a historic peace summit. One from Ted Snyder, does Zelensky want peace or war? And our spotlights from Connor O'Keefe, bringing the war on terror to our southern border can only end in disaster. So please go check all of that out. Lots of stuff going on. I feel like there was something else I wanted to mention, but I cannot remember. But again, I hope everyone, happy Easter to everyone. I enjoyed my weekend off. And I am thankful for my boss, Eric, and all the guys who filled in to do some extra writing for me, for letting me take that day off. And pray for Pope Francis. Pray for the Catholic Church, especially all you Catholics out there. You could always support this show by liking, subscribing, commenting. I will be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.